This right here is a socketable CPU for laptops. This kind of stuff are things that we just don't see anymore, but the story that it tells is as fascinating as the chip itself. Let's take a look at it. This is the Intel Pentium T4500, a laptop CPU built by Intel in 2010, with 2 cores, 2 threads clocked at 2.3 GHz. It has an 800 MHz frontside bus and a whopping 1 MB of L2 cache. Wow! But let's take a step back from those amazing specs for a moment and take a look at the chip itself. It's got a singular exposed die and some markings that identify what it is, and on the back it has pins. These pins correspond to the holes found on socket P, also known as MPGA 478, meaning that this chip has 478 pins on the bottom and can slot into any MPGA 478 equipped motherboard like this one. Socketed laptop chips have gone the way of the dodo in the last few years for reasons that I will get into later. But taking a look at the motherboard, you can see that there are 2 other notable chips on here. One is this like black rectangular thing, and this other one that looks like a CPU. Well, both of these are part of Intel's Centrino 2 platform, codenamed Montevina. This massive black one right here, this is the I/O controller hub, or South Bridge, codenamed ICH9M, while this one is actually the graphics and memory controller, codenamed Cantiga. They support CPUs like the T4500 that are based on Intel's Penryn architecture, and that is what we will be focusing on today. Penryn was the mobile tick or die shrink to Intel's famous core architecture that replaced NetBurst. The tale of NetBurst, Core, and Intel's tick-tock cadence is something we will discuss in future, but for a very short primer is that NetBurst was the architecture used on Intel's infamous hot and heavy Pentium 4s. Core was developed as a replacement to NetBurst, focusing on efficiency rather than sheer clock speeds. It helped Intel recover from being slammed by AMD and allowed them eventually to regain the performance crown. Penryn, like Wolfdale on the desktop, shrunk Core down from 65 to 45 nanometer to further increase this efficiency. And this made sense because Penryn was destined for laptops, which by their very nature had little cooling compared to desktops and needed to conserve battery life. Its brother Miram was also based on the Core architecture, using the original 65 nanometer process node, and succeeded Iona, which was based on a modified P6. This is noteworthy because the Core architecture was based on the P6, which had powered the Pentium 3 and Pentium Pro that preceded NetBurst's Pentium 4. Core was not developed from NetBurst due to the fact that P6, while being an older architecture, was more efficient than NetBurst. This was something that Intel learned when they tried to make the Pentium 4M. Yeah, NetBurst really was that bad. Penryn had big shoes to fill. Miram, Iona, and the earlier Banias and Dothan cores all had great reputation considering NetBurst's failure. It did bring a lot to the table, like an increase, or should I say doubling, of L2 cache, the aforementioned shrink to 45 nanometer, and improvements in clock speed, efficiency, and low and idle power draw. In the end, while it didn't completely blow Miram out of the water, it was a good enough upgrade for the same price and paved the way for Intel's consumer ultra-low voltage chips that had CPUs with TDPs of 15 watts and under, and the first quad-core laptops like the Q and the QX series. As for this guy right here, this Pentium dual core is based on Penryn 3M, a smaller version of Penryn for chips that had less than 3 megabytes of L2 cache, but still maintained compatibility with Socket P and the accompanying chipsets that came along with it. This was actually one of the last eras where a lot of the functionality was on the chipsets that were soldered onto the motherboard. The ICH here is still found on most motherboards today, it's just called the chipset, while the graphics/memory controller has been completely axed and instead, just integrated directly onto the CPU die itself. This was the second to the last generation of chips to use an external graphics/memory controller, and the last to use Intel's GMA architecture for its internal graphics instead of Intel's HD graphics, which they introduced with Nehalem. Sadly, this does not turn on, if any of you have guessed by now, but it's still really cool retro tech that we just don't see anymore. Chips on laptops these days are soldered onto the board. In fact, I have another motherboard right here. This guy is just 2 generations from this stuff, and it already had, there we go, the CPU soldered onto the motherboard. This was from an era when computing legitimately moved very quickly. By the arrival of this stuff, this was very much close to obsolete. Now, we have seemed to have returned to that era, but what definitely haven't returned yet is the amount of upgradability that was offered back then, when you could quite literally change the CPU in your laptop for something faster in future. There are advantages to our approach. This thing has a 35-watt TDP, while nowadays most ultra-low voltage chips have 15-watt TDPs or lower and have much more performance, features, and tech built into them than this thing could ever hope to have. And having everything tightly integrated increases overall efficiency and optimization. But it has definitely come at the cost of not being able to upgrade to faster hardware should we want to, with even RAM and storage being soldered nowadays. Whether or not that is a worthwhile trade-off, I will leave that up to you, but you can't deny that crazy concepts like the Alienware laptops that had socketable CPUs are not actually that crazy when you think about it, considering that they trace their roots back to something that existed and was common just a decade ago. Core proved to be a success in changing Intel's fortunes, and its successor, Nehalem, paved the way for Intel's return to complete, uncontested dominance. As for how well that turned out, well, stay tuned because a video is coming about the architecture that signified the start of the modern core wars and the awakening of the sleeping blue giant. Spoilers, it's coffee related. Thanks for watching.